So I want to let you know there was some discussion this morning about where this 4-star rating actually came from. The reality is that it actually is the flag now of the city of Chicago. So just to let you know that where this is. And Stephen and I both being from Chicago, we thought we'd demystify this whole notion of where 4 stars come from. So one thing before I get into Stephen's introduction, we have feedback forms for you on your tables. We'd really appreciate if you take some time and fill those out and hand those out to us before we're done. So it's my pleasure actually to introduce both a friend and colleague from Chicago. And for Stephen's introduction, we've actually posted a link to his bio both in the agenda and in his profile if you want to know more about him. But what you need to know about Stephen is really his leadership has been instrumental really in bringing technology, and particularly health tech, and putting it on the map of our city and now regionally and globally. And it's been really a larger part of a reinvigoration in Chicago tech, where now young, diverse leadership aligned with our business and academic community have really come together. So Matter, Stephen's company, started in 2015, a handful of startups, and now hundreds of companies, I know he'll tell you about, they're engaged in the innovation acceleration process, which really brings together entrepreneurs, clinicians, investors, experienced leaders, together to really reimagine the next generation of healthcare technology. So Stephen, through Matter, has built a community to enable the creative, doing what matters, educating, coaching, connecting young entrepreneurs to really change healthcare. So as I think about our last session here, I think there's no better person to talk to really set up this discussion about what's next. And I want to personally thank Stephen really for not only for being here, but for his leadership and on behalf of all those young entrepreneurs that have really been given a hand up in our industry. Stephen?
Well, Tim, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks. That was a heartwarming introduction. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I actually have really enjoyed this. I have learned, I've increased my knowledge of KLAS by 150 million% in the last 24 hours, and it's really interesting. I've really appreciated the opportunity to get to know a little bit more kind of under the hood how it works and get to know some of the people and really what this enterprise is about, and look forward to collaborating in the weeks and months and years ahead. I'm going to share, because I know a lot of you aren't entirely familiar with what Matter is and what we do, so I'm going to spend, 5 minutes. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. Happy to answer as many questions as you want, but about who we are and what we do, so you also understand a little bit of the perspective that I'm bringing. But I'm going to spend more of the time on some trends that we're seeing in digital health, which I'm sure you're seeing as well, a little bit about why we're seeing those trends, and then some of what the implications are, and then just a few examples of some of the companies that we work with that when you think about beyond the EHR, because we know that's solved when it comes to interoperability, like beyond that, just so you can start thinking about other kinds of data, other kinds of organizations that to really achieve the premise or the reason to have interoperability, to be able to make better decisions and have better understandings and make and ultimately to keep people healthier by using their data in the best way possible, what ultimately that could mean down the line. So if I will start. This is the mission of Matter, is accelerate the pace of change of healthcare. Generally, the scope that we have is anything that has the potential to improve health or the business of healthcare scope. Our core belief, which I believe will resonate in this room just based on what this entire meeting is about, is that collaboration is really the only way to innovate in healthcare. We do not believe in sort of a model that there's going to be these disruptive technology innovators who are going to come blow up the system, or that really in order to develop the best solutions and envision what those are going to be and design them and test them and scale them and achieve any real meaningful impact, You have to have entrepreneurs collaborating with the established parts of the industry from day one of their effort. And on the flip side, the established industry, whether it's health systems, payers, life sciences companies, really can't innovate fast enough internally in order to capitalize on all the opportunities that are presented by emerging technologies. And so the best innovations are when there are these collaborations across different parts of the industry. Our model, we do three things. So we incubate startups, and I'll talk very briefly about each of these. We incubate startups. We are kind of a nexus for a community of people who are passionate about healthcare innovation and healthcare transformation. In Chicago, which is where we're headquartered, as Tim alluded, we have a space that in a previous lifetime ago, it feels like, was really a nexus in Chicago for healthcare innovation and healthcare technology, and maybe it will be again. We'll see how the world kind of plays out and evolves. And then we work with established entities, and we provide innovation services to help them build their innovation capacity. Since we started in early 2015, we're going to celebrate actually our 7th birthday this month. So happy birthday, Matter. And we've worked with a little more than 700 companies. They are primarily digital health, about 2/3 digital health companies. But we also work with therapeutics and devices and diagnostics and a little bit of services. They range from 1 or 2 person companies that are really just getting started to companies that have 100 or 200 people and they're scaling up in the market. They are all over the world. About 45% are in Chicago, where our headquarters services to help them. We have a curriculum with about 100 classes in it. We have different mentoring programs. We help them raise money. We help them get customers. To help them at every stage of development along the way. The companies that we worked with in 2021, there were 387 of them. In aggregate, they have raised $2.25 billion. Their solutions have benefited about 250 million people, and in 2021, they generated in aggregate about $280 million in revenues. As a nexus for the healthcare community, so again, last year we had about 6,000 people attend our events. They were all virtual, except for one, I think, in this little brief window where we thought we were free of this. But we did about 40 kind of what we call thought leadership events, and then we rely on a volunteer network. So we are organized as a nonprofit entity. We really started with this mission, and we started with this premise around collaboration, and want to figure out how can we create a platform that's neutral, that can allow for the maximum amount of collaboration. And one of the things we benefit from is a lot of volunteer hours. All of our faculty, all of our mentors donate their time and volunteer. Since we started, we've worked with about 130 established entities. A lot of our perspective on the market and how the world actually works comes from these conversations, from providers, from life sciences companies, from payers. You can see sort of a smattering of kind of what they look like. They're around the country and around the world, and we have different services to help bigger companies find, source, and co-develop solutions together with entrepreneurs. We have insights capabilities, we have training capabilities. Again, happy to go into any more of that during the Q&A, and I don't want to spend too much time on kind of who we are, but wanted to give you a framework for kind of the perspective I bring to this conversation. All right, so digital health trends. So if you look at venture investment in digital health companies starting in 2010, which is on the left side, if you can't read that, it was about $1 billion. It went up to $22 billion in 2020. The red line is only through Q3. I haven't seen the data for a full year. The expectation is it'll be 40 plus billion, so it'll be roughly double what it was in 2020. So a couple of things to take away from this. One, like this is increasing incredibly rapidly. And even if you take out 2021, which is a bit of an anomaly, the entire venture industry has gone a little bit bananas. And so even if you take that out, and you look at the trend from 2010 to 2020, this rate of increase of investment in digital health is about 5 times the rate of increase of the venture capital industry overall. So there's something different going on with digital health. It's not just that more and more money's flowing into venture, and depending on how close you are to it, you hear about that and inflated valuations and bigger rounds and things like that. But there's something in particular going on with digital health. It kind of went from almost nothing, $1 billion is nothing, but in the grand scheme of venture capital, it's not very much, to, depending on the source you look at, 5 to 8% of total venture capital investment globally. And that's a big change in a decade. So why is that? So I'm going to give you 2 reasons that are particular to healthcare. There are other things. There are, technologies evolving really rapidly. There's analytics frameworks, which are now very accessible, and you can do things with them. And back in 2010, it required an army of people to engineer them, and cloud service. I mean, there's a lot of things you can point to as to why that aren't unique to healthcare, that are driving an increase in entrepreneurship, that are driving an increase in innovation. But again, if you go back to that 5 times the rate of increase in digital health investment versus the rest of the industry, the question I think is more interesting is why is that? What's really happening? So one is that the business of healthcare is in flux. It's changing. We're transitioning to value-based care. This is, I'm not sure exactly what the best way to represent the transition to value-based care is. It's something I struggle with. If anybody has a better idea than this, I'm very open to it. This is something Change Healthcare published. These are the number of states implementing value-based care models. Change Healthcare argues that this is the real measure because if you look at Medicaid and the purview of control of states, it's really more significant than CMS, and it doesn't really matter. So we can pick this apart, but don't worry about that. The point is it went from basically nothing in 2008, 2010, to almost every state has at least some value-based care experiment. And I think you would all agree that while we have a long way to go before we're operating in sort of a true value-based care environment, that we're in a very different world than we were a decade ago. This has enormous implications for entrepreneurs because, in fact, it is very possible and not even that hard to come up with something that can improve health, some intervention that can improve health, that nobody will ever pay for because of the way healthcare gets paid for and healthcare gets reimbursed. And the more we move towards a world in which the economic incentives are aligned with the outcomes incentives for everybody in the healthcare value chain, this sort of value-based nirvana that maybe we'll get to at some point in time, but at least we're moving in that direction. The farther we move in that direction, the more doors are open to innovators and to entrepreneurs to deploy interventions that somebody will actually pay for. So we've seen this transition be a huge driver of entrepreneurship and innovation in digital health. So the second reason is just simply there's a lot of data. And if you look for electronic medical records, again, you go back to that 2010 timeframe, which was the beginning of the chart around investment. 18% of I think it's acute care facilities had some EHR implementation. It really reached ubiquity in 2015, and obviously there's other sites and other things that have happened. And we don't live in a paper-based world anymore, although I think it was this morning, I was at a table with some of you talking about faxes and things, and it's almost embarrassing when I talk to people who aren't in healthcare and other industries, and they're like, well, why don't you do this? And I'm like, well, you have to fax certain things. They're like, what? What do you mean you have to fax something? Like, what? Where do you even find a fax machine? But we live primarily in a world of electronic data now, and this unlocks enormous potential for entrepreneurs, for innovators within health systems, within payers, but also outside of that, and that's where a lot of that investment is flowing. But it's not just EMRs, as you all know. So you got wearables. I'll talk a little bit more about Ember Labs, but as an exemplar of wearables. You've got other kinds of devices. I threw this one up. It's one of our companies, and the reason why I threw it up is so they attach a device to a walker that's essentially like a Fitbit for a walker, because you can't put an activity monitor on somebody who's using a walker, because the dynamics are different. So they've built one. And you can look at that and be like, that's kind of silly. But in fact, they're collecting data that clinicians are finding valuable, because they are finding out how people are moving around with walkers. And there are like a million examples like that of ways to collect data from sensors that are now very affordable and can be deployed fairly ubiquitously. And they can generate data that is relevant in some way to health. And then things like My Sugar, you may have heard of it. It's an app for people with diabetes. It collects, so it connects to glucose monitors. It also, you put in data about what you're eating, your insulin dosing. It has recommendation engines about bolus dosing and things like that. But that data doesn't exist in an EMR. That exists somewhere else. So apps, wearables, other devices, there's a lot of categories that are generating data. There's a lot of stuff floating around out there, like 90,000 new consumer health apps in 2020. I'm honestly not even sure what that means. And so it's going to be great when KLAS enters the sort of more emerging stage things and can help sort out the wheat from the chaff, because there's a lot of nonsense here, but there's also a lot of really interesting. And I put up these numbers not so that people can groan and roll their eyes and like, oh gosh, we know there's like an app for everything. But to say there is an incredible amount of energy and attention from people who are passionate about improving health, building software-based solutions. And those things are generating and using data in different ways. And so within these hundreds of thousands of things, even if it's, you know, a small percentage of these that are really meaningful, there's a lot of stuff out there. And it's collecting data and generating data, and people are using it, and it's important to think about it. So data, healthcare data grew 15x in 7 years. So this is measured in exabytes. Can someone tell us what an exabyte is? Because I cannot. But somebody, does anyone know what an exabyte is? 1,000 petabytes. 1,000 petabytes? I have 1,000 petabytes. 1,000 terabytes.
So it's less than a petabyte?
It's above peta. I feel actually a lot better now, because I actually don't know what an exabyte is. All I know is it's an enormous amount. It's humongous. And thank you for making me feel better. So we went from 153 exabytes in 2013 to 2020, 2,314 exabytes of healthcare data. It's a little abstract, so think about it a little bit differently. So healthcare now represents about 30% of all data in the universe, 30% of all data. And it's growing faster than other industries. So healthcare is growing at 36% a year in terms of the volume of data. You've got manufacturing at 30%. A lot of people think manufacturing has the most data of anything, because you just think about all of the steps that go into manufacturing and all the assembly lines and supply chains and logistics and distribution. But healthcare is growing faster than that and represents more than that. Financial services, media, the entire global data sphere. Healthcare data is bigger than all these other industries and growing faster than all of these other industries. And then some of this is, these are social terms of health, which I've heard in several of the conversations sort of come up. It's not, depending on which one of these things, you may consider it health data, you may not consider it health data. A lot of this probably isn't in the health data numbers and sort of equations, but it is data that's absolutely relevant to health and is more and more part of the conversation about health, but isn't generally captured in a way that can be enmeshed and analyzed and sort of flow through a system in a way that good interoperable health data can, even that's limited and growing, to really be able to generate the right kind of insights at an individual level or a population level. So I pulled out a few examples like Google, Experian, Amazon. You think about companies like that and what they know about you, or you think about some of the companies that, like Datalogix isn't on here, but they know an incredible amount about you from a retail and consumer perspective, or some of the financial services firms, and what it is that they know about you that allows them to influence you to buy something else. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of variables that these companies collect, and they have sophisticated engines to analyze it, to understand who you are and when you're going to buy something and what you're going to buy and how to present that information to you. Just imagine what we could do if healthcare data could flow around in the way that other data could, and the insights that we could generate about individuals, the insights we could generate about different populations to ultimately help improve health rather than, just improving, the retail experience. So when I think about interoperability and what it ultimately means in the long run, I'm thinking about this kind of thing. So from a clinical perspective, if I'm trying to treat, what if I could know everything that there was to know about that person and their history and all of the different pieces that make up their current health state? What would I be able to intuit about them today, and what would I be able to predict about them in the future? And if I were a researcher, if I was able to tap into not just sort of discrete data sets and try to work them together and blend them together, or buy this and put this together, but if I had access to all of these different kinds of data that could flow back and forth, the kind of insights that I could generate that could ultimately really improve human health that aren't available today. Value-based care plus this fantasy world of holistic, interoperable data of all types and all sorts. We put that together, and what does it equal? So today, and really for history, our healthcare system has been very episodic. So when you interact with the healthcare system when something goes wrong. You go to a pharmacy, you go to a doctor, you go to a hospital. The world where we're moving is one where it's much more of a continuous, anytime, anywhere interaction with the healthcare system. And I'll show a couple of examples of things that sort of point in this direction, where the technology actually in many ways is already here for some applications in this realm. Where you can interact essentially with the healthcare system all the time without, dipping in and then disappearing for extended periods of time. Today, our system, and historically the system, is very reactive. Again, when something goes wrong, you go to the healthcare system to try to fix it. We are moving, and will hopefully, in the not too many lifetimes away, get to a system that is truly predictive, that is truly proactive, and truly personalized, where instead of calling the healthcare system, calling a doctor when something goes wrong, the healthcare system, just put quotes around all of that, calls you before you even know that there's something wrong. That's where we're heading. That's where technology is taking us. And the faster we can get to a truly interoperable sort of liquid data of all these types, the faster we're going to get here. So I'm going to give you now a few examples, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So I have 5 companies here. I'm just going to run through them. These are all Matter member companies that I picked out. Just the kinds of things that are not interoperable today, but should be at some point in the future. So the first one is a company called Sonar MD. It was started by a doctor named Larry Kaczynski. He's a gastroenterologist. And he was frustrated. He treats a lot of patients with IBD, with inflammatory bowel disease. And his experience was that he would see them in his office, they'd be doing okay, and then a few months later, you might get a call from the hospital saying, hey, one of your patients here, they're in bad shape. Turns out they need part of their bowel removed. You know, they've really gone downhill. And he, you know, this would happen over and over, and he got really frustrated, saying, if I only had a way of keeping in touch with them, of understanding what's happening to them in between these, you know, annual visits, I could probably intervene and help them, because there's things I can do. There's new drugs. There's things that I could, different interventions. So what the analogy he had in his head was, his patients are like submarines. They pop up out of the ocean, and they come to his office, and then they disappear under the ocean, and he doesn't have any contact with them until they pop up. And so he wanted a sonar system that could ping them on a regular basis and see how they were doing. So he developed a system, a very simple text-based thing, sends a text message to his patients. They click on a link. He took something called a Crohn's Disease Activity Index, which is a well-validated instrument that gastroenterologists use, and he kind of adapted it for this purpose. And so they answer a few questions, very fast, and then that goes into his system, and he pings the patients on a regular basis. He ran a study with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois. It's a Chicago-based company. It was like 300-something patients, and what they found was that patients that were using Sonar MD versus the ones who weren't, 50% reduction in hospitalizations, increased use of biologics, because those are sort of the next generation therapies, and the physicians were able to put them on those drugs faster to control their disease. Overall costs went down by about 20%, including everything. Patients were happier. It was great. That is there's nothing particularly remarkable about the technology in this company. There's nothing that sophisticated about the algorithms, about the way that they collect data. It's just a question of, actually the biggest challenge for this company is the business model, because that business model in and of itself, nobody wants to pay for. That's not enough of a priority for the payers, the health systems. I mean, frankly, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was telling him all about this, and I was excited, and he's like, well, that's a terrible idea, because then they won't come for surgeries. I mean, he was kidding, but then they won't come for surgeries, and that's, so he was kidding, but if you look at the economics of this, it doesn't pay for a health system, and health systems have to make money in order to function. So this is an example of, you know, both data that should be incorporated into an EMR. It's not. It sits on a separate terminal, and so somebody in his office needs to look at that terminal every day, and it stratifies all the patients based on their responses, and then they can reach out, but it's not integrated. And we need to be farther along the continuum towards value-based care for this and similar kinds of solutions to really take off. Another company called Day 2 is an Israeli company. It's a precision medicine microbiome company. So their initial focus is on diabetes and creating sort of a nutritional roadmap for people based on their gut microbiome. So they send you a kit, you put a stool sample, you send it back, they do their analyses, and then they send you the recommendations, and they have some coaching. This exists outside of the EMR. Like this data, and you can use this as a proxy for omics, different kinds of genomic data and other omics that gets collected. And even if it gets into the EMR, it probably doesn't exist in there in a way that can be used by clinical decision makers at the right moments, that serve the right information at the right moments in time. I remember, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I did a pharmacogenomic analysis for a health system in Chicago, because they came to Matter and they wanted to talk about what they were doing. And so I did this, and I ended up with they had a PDF of a document of me and how I would react to certain drugs, and I asked what to do with it, and they've become a little bit more sophisticated. It basically just sits as a document attached to the EMR, and that isn't ultimately where we need to go. That kind of information needs to sort of exist in a system that can cooperate with the rest of the data and generate insights at the right point in time so that it can affect clinical care in a positive. This company, Xander Cardian, it's a Korean company. So this device, as a disclaimer, I'm a personal investor in this company. This device is a radar device. So it sits on a wall. They originally developed this device for building management. So they can use these devices and tell better than cameras, better than sensors, better than anything else, who's coming in the building, where they're going, how they're moving around. They realized that the real long-term opportunity for this technology is in healthcare because they can measure resting heart rate and respiration rate and activity at an incredibly fine resolution, incredibly accurately, just by putting one of these things on the walls. They're not cameras, so they're not, some of the privacy issues aren't there. They have a number of use cases. One of them that I think is particularly cool that they're in a clinical trial right now with a children's hospital is in the NICU. And if you look at babies in the NICU, they got all these leads attached to them, and they're being monitored, and they often don't have blankets over them. And this can measure all of those things through blankets, through clothing, through furniture, through walls. It doesn't, because it's radar, the way that it works. And so they're testing it in the NICU to replace all of that, and so the baby can be under blankets and things like that. So there are home health applications. There are lots of applications to this. So the point is, it's just another category of devices. There are things that sit under mattresses. There are things that sit in floors. This happens to sit on walls or ceilings to generate data that ultimately has implications for health, but again, sits outside of the sort of world of interoperable data. PhysIQ, I have two more of these. PhysIQ is another Chicago-based company. So this company was sort of emerged. There was a company called Smart Signal that was ultimately acquired by GE, and they developed algorithms to measure the health of jet engines and nuclear power plants. So what they wanted was a system where the jet engine would essentially tell the mechanics that, hey, something's wrong with me before a screw fell out or before something catastrophic happened. When they sold the company to GE, Gary retained the rights effectively to use the algorithms and develop them for healthcare. So he's been at this for a number of years. The system that he's developed takes basically uses one circadian rhythm to create a baseline, an individualized baseline for you as a person, and then monitors same kinds of things: respiration rate, heart rate, I think skin temperature. There's a few different things that they can measure. And they give it, one of their applications is for people who have heart conditions, and they've had an incident, they're coming out of the hospital, they are very likely to be readmitted for another incident. Their system can predict up to a week in advance that this person is going to have another heart attack. And so then they can intervene, and they can call the person. They can get tremendous results. They think that they can quantify pain. They think there are lots of emerging solutions that they are developing. But again, this data doesn't have a place to live that exists with all of the other data that's out there. And the last one, and then there'll be time for questions, is Ember Labs. So this one, it's a wearable. It tricks your body into thinking you are hotter or colder than you are. The science comes from MIT. This little device generates hot or cold with certain waveforms that have a particular ability to convince your body that you are warmer or colder. So their first clinical use case is for menopausal women with hot flashes. And they have, so they can make it by using this device, and you can convince yourself you're not having a hot flash. Having learned from this company a lot about hot flashes, I am grateful that I don't have to go through that. But it works. They also have sold a lot to people who, like, their offices are too cold, and so this convinces their body that they're warmer. It's really interesting technology. I chose this one because I don't really know what the use of this kind of data would be if you mixed it up with a lot of other data in clinical applications. Like, is it actually going to be useful to know when this person felt like they were too hot, or when this person felt like they were too cold, or how often that was happening? I don't know. But there is some research that they're tapped into on social thermoregulation, which I found kind of interesting. They're researchers, and they gave a group of people a cup of hot coffee, and they gave a group of people an iced coffee. It turns out the people who had hot coffee perceived the people around them to be more generous and caring and trustworthy than the people who were carrying a cup of iced coffee. And there's a bunch of experiments like that in different ways that create a link between your cognitive state or your emotional state and temperature in one way or another. And I don't know where all that's going to lead, but what if all of that data could be combined with all of the other omic data and clinical data and all of that other data, and researchers could tap into it and start to mine for correlations and causations? Who knows what we could come up with? And to me, that's what a future state of kind of data nirvana, of fully interoperable, useful data would look like, is that level of data is available to clinicians and researchers effectively on demand to be able to generate the kind of insights, some of which we can posit today, and some of which we really don't know, and we won't know until we have access to all of that data. So that's where I hope we're going. I think I'm only like 1 or 2 minutes over, so we have plenty of time for questions if you have any.
Thank you for that, Stephen. I think one of the things that we'd like to hear about in using some of these apps and even some of the wearables is there's so many of them out there. And some have science behind them, and some have clinical trials behind them, but the vast majority don't. So in order to get clinicians to use them, prescribe them, which way you might want to use that terminology, it might be good to try to figure out which ones do have clinical trials that have evidence that they work versus randomly trying things over and over and over again.
Yes, I agree. I would not use one that didn't have science behind it, that didn't have data, that didn't have some sort of evidence that it was going to do something, for sure. And yeah, I'm not sure how to answer the question. I mean, so one of the things we talk to our members about in our companies is, you got to have some data. Like, you got to, like, who, because if you listen to their pitches, they all sound incredible, and or most of them, and so you got to come up with a way to generate the science, to generate the data. The ones that I showed, so the Radar one and the PhysIQ one are both FDA approved. The Ember Labs one, they've sold like 100,000 of these just direct to consumer. It was sort of like, oh my gosh, this thing's working, and they kept building on it. But the science out of MIT is fascinating on that one. Like a KLAS sort of system. Yeah.
Approval is huge, but something that says, hey, there is science behind this, there is evidence, and these are validated by science.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And it's hard, and it's hard for, we talk to a lot of health systems and a lot of payers and a lot of employers, and they get a gazillion calls a week and pitches and things, and so they're trying to sort it out. So yeah, I also think it's probably going to get worse before it gets better, because there's so much opportunity and there's so much money, as you saw, flowing into the space. But it'll get better. Yeah.
So talk a little bit about your process of how you connect these companies then with healthcare providers or healthcare institutions that might be interested in doing the interoperability that you're talking about?
So I guess there's a few different ways. We work with companies that are at different stages. So the really early ones, the connections that they need to health systems or payers or technology companies or others tend to be we need to validate whether this works, we need to generate some data, we need to sort of get that kind of experience. The later stage ones, that have a bunch of customers, it's more like new applications that they're trying to develop, or new solutions, or they're looking for different kinds of partners. That's mostly the kinds of connections we're making. When it comes to interoperability, to actually answer your question, we're really not. We don't have the capability to solve that. But somebody needs to. Somebody needs to do that. So what we can do is talk about it. We can convene about it. Is sort of what we do. But we don't have the sort of technical abilities to actually solve that issue, other than telling people it's important and you got to figure out how to do that. But a lot of I know that there's different, I think, EMR vendors in here. Different EMR vendors claim different levels of ability to work with small, emerging startups. I will tell you, they are all terrible and almost impossible to integrate with if you are an emerging company. And so it's a challenge to figure out. And I don't mean that they are terrible, but it doesn't mean that there aren't good reasons for that, or that there aren't, challenge, and that this isn't trying to make this personal. I'm just saying I'm going to rephrase it. From the perspective of a lot of these startup companies, it's impossible to integrate with most of the EMR vendors. And I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Stephen, you touched upon this when you talked about the Crohn's disease use case, business value. And it's always been a problem for innovative ideas in healthcare. Who pays for it, right? Go after the money. Can you comment, do you see any progress? I mean, we know that the payers, what we call the payers, in many cases are not the payers, right? The real payers in our healthcare system are employers and the government, and the payers are sitting just in between as administrators. So they are not really incented to reduce costs because, like the doctor who loses his surgery, the payers lose the revenue that they can put their margin on. But have you seen with this transition to value-based care that there is more interest from the real payers to sponsor initiatives like this that really drive cost out of the system?
So what I've seen is that increased interest among employers. So if you go back 5 years, we really weren't seeing employers as having a lot of interest in digital health solutions. And it just wasn't what they did. They didn't have the people or the capabilities or the interest, with certain exceptions. And now we see a huge interest among employers. they still don't really have the, because they're not providers and they're not, like, they don't have the, so they have to rely on other platforms or other parties, and we see those platforms building up. Things like Gaslight is an example of where they're trying to build an ecosystem of their own and have other solutions plug into their platform. So employers are one, because big employers are bearing risk. We've seen providers that are to some ACOs, but different provider value-based arrangements. We've seen some of those be, I guess, effective in sparking interest in more solutions like that Sonar MD example. I mean, these are all like anecdotal or it's not like a systemic thing. But yes, we've seen payer-provider organizations be particularly interested in these kinds of solutions. And then we've seen like Medicare Advantage being a pretty interesting driver of that. So Humana is a little challenging to work with because they're just huge, but they have an interest in these kinds of things, and they're interested in experimenting in different ways. We've seen a lot of innovation at the Medicaid level because states, the earlier point, states have been kind of pushing value-based care. So it's sort of, there's like hotspots around, but not a systemic, it's like a COVID map. Like things are sort of emerging and changing color, but it's not like the whole country, it's not like Omicron yet where the whole country is red. It's sort of, we see a lot of movement in that direction from different stakeholders. And on the part of the vendors, by the way, we see a lot more of them developing business models where they share risk and where they take risk, where they're not just looking for a fee in exchange for a service. They're actually willing to kind of put something on the line and say, we'll only get paid if it works. Not ubiquitous by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that's an interesting trend that we're seeing more and more of.
Yeah, hi. Actually, it's a nice lead-in question because the follow-up question is many larger health systems are setting aside and putting towards significant funds to set up their own digital innovation labs, where they're teaming with a lot of these emerging market companies in exchange for use cases and data. So where do you see that footprint being important in this field, and is it large enough to really make significant changes? I see health systems obviously can carry a lot of weight with other people in the health system ecosystem to make changes where they needed to then move the data. But do health systems have a big enough footprint? Do they carry around enough dollars to really make an impact in the larger ecosystem?
Yeah, I love those things, and there are some health systems that are doing really innovative things around data, around working with some of these kinds of companies, around creating their own kinds of companies like this, creating their own sort of ecosystems, their own data warehouses or data lakes that have the ability to ingest data from lots of different sources. There's some really interesting examples out there. I think it's a little, so 98% of the health systems don't have the resources or they don't have the resources or the capabilities to do that kind of thing. 95%, whatever it is. Vast majority can't do that. So I think what'll be interesting to see, yeah.
Is it that they can't, or they're just not forward thinking enough to put the money aside to get it back later?
All right,
in a shared,
that's
like
fair.
If you're talking about value-based and shared
Yeah.
savings models and risk,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes, so.
All right, it's fair. There is some percentage that can't. I don't know what that percentage is. I think it would actually be interesting. Makes me want to go do some more homework and come up with some thinking around that. I mean, I would say, just off the top of my head, at least 50, 60% probably don't have the resources to do it even if they really wanted to. And then it's maybe more than that, and I'd have to go think that through and take a deeper look. And then there are, and then there's a combination of can't and don't want to, or don't want to make those kinds of investments. I think COVID has probably not helped in that regard. Maybe it pushed it from 50-60% to 70-75% that really don't have the resources to be able to do that right now. But that said, there are different models that are generating really interesting use cases, really interesting data, really interesting companies, and not every health system needs to be in that game in order to ultimately make a real difference across the whole industry. So I think we're seeing more health systems doing more innovative, more interesting things, and I love that.
Stephen, I have one question for you.
Yeah.
We talked about how healthcare can lean into some of this change, right? One interesting evolution is the building of these data consortiums, right?
Yeah.
The Truvettas of the world and so
Yeah,
on.
graphite.
The Truvettas of the world to actually create the large-scale data sets we need in order to do the innovation we need, and particularly the research we need.
Yep.
To have large enough unbiased data together. Do you see that as a nexus for how some of this change might be enabled? For
Maybe.
how healthcare companies or
Yeah.
life science companies plug in? It's kind of like an ecosystem question. If I had to have you cast forward, we're going to have to do this collaboratively. What are some of the nexus points of ecosystems you see in the next year or 2 or 3 so that we get to the point where we can take advantage of all these investments and all this change to really help us in a creative and appropriate way disrupt the health system we have today?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's a lot of potential in some of those things. I mean, you look at who's participating in Truveta, or who's participating in graphite, who's participating in some of these bigger things. It's really interesting, and the jury's out. Like I don't think they've developed to a point yet where it can really answer that question. Like that's it, and then they can really keep expanding and growing. But I think there's a ton of potential there, and I think in the next 2-3 years, as those evolve, there's an enormous opportunity there. And again, just listening to what they're trying to do is very sounds great, and we'll see how that evolves. But there've been a lot of, I guess part of me is also skeptical that we're actually going to get there. I've seen a lot of efforts to try to combine data across health systems, across different parts of the industry, and a lot of them haven't worked. And so it remains to be seen whether they can power through the complexities, some technical complexities, but a lot more policy and legal and other complexities to be able to get there, to have that be another model for innovation that can be out there. We do, life sciences companies, I think you mentioned, some of the life sciences companies actually have enormous data sets that they've built themselves, and they've gone out and bought this and bought that and acquired this and come up with a link there because they have a lot of money, and they're using that and they're mining those data for research purposes. And but those are closed, and so the potential of some of these other things that you mentioned is that they're not so closed, that they're more open.
Good. Well, please join me in thanking Stephen for being with us today.
Well, thank you.